Hi, I'm Russell Rainey, and I have a father and son story I'd like to share with you. It's my story. It's also a story about the power of story to change lives. Growing up, I had a tough relationship with my dad. We were constantly at war with each other. I blamed it on his anger and how hard he rode me. He blamed it on my troublemaking and rebelliousness. Years later, we admitted to each other that we were both right. For 25 years, my dad and I butted heads on just about everything, until my wife and I and our 2 kids moved 1,600 miles away from Little Rock, Arkansas to Jackson Hole, Wyoming. It was this distance that gave my dad and I a truce, where we just let each other live our own lives, but with no real relationship. And then 10 years later, I came home to Little Rock for Christmas, and everything changed. I was 35 and my dad was 65, and it was going to be a special Christmas because my dad's mom, Grandma Freehite, was coming down from Minnesota, which she rarely did. And my daughter Brittany was so excited because she and Grandma Freehite loved to talk and laugh and act more like sisters than anything else. On Christmas Eve, everyone was over at my folks' house. And at one point, Grandma Freehite, Brittany, my dad, and I were sitting around a table when Brittany started interviewing Grandma Freehite about her high school boyfriends, because Brittany had just recently gotten interested in boys and she was looking for some advice. It wasn't long before Grandma Freehite was telling the story about her husband, my grandfather, my dad's dad. Now, I didn't know much about this story. All I knew about my grandfather was that he had died when my dad was young. But Grandma Freehite was now telling a different story. She was telling Brittany that he hadn't died, but had actually abandoned the family when my dad was 2 years old. I just knew this couldn't be true. I just knew that Grandma Freehite was somehow remembering it wrong. But then I looked over at my dad, and in an instant, I knew it was true. He already had tears streaming down his cheeks, his face racked with pain. This realization suddenly explained so much to me. This was the missing link. This was the part of my dad's story that I needed to know. And in that instant, I went from being angry at my dad for all the things he'd done wrong to being amazed at my dad for all the things he'd done right. Over the next couple of years, my dad and I walked down a tough, sometimes really tough, road to redemption. In time, we emerged from that journey forever changed as men, as fathers, and as sons. Along the way, I learned that my dad was so ashamed of his dad abandoning the family that my mom hadn't learned about it until they were married for almost 10 years. And most impactfully, I learned that my father had lived with the horrible memory of his dad walking in the house one day, seeing him playing on the floor as a 2-year-old and saying, "You're not worth it." Then he walked out, never to be seen again. My dad was 67 years old when he finally surfaced that memory. Now, whether it happened exactly like that or not doesn't really matter, because that 2-year-old boy believed it had. And for 65 years, my dad stuffed the pain of that moment deep into his heart. He also stuffed the guilt of believing that if he'd been a better 2-year-old, his mom and brothers and sisters would not have had to suffer so much. As tough as that road was to walk with my dad, we both experienced the forgiveness and restoration that comes from a son knowing his dad's real story. As I told you, this is a story about the power of story, and there's more. After my dad and I began experiencing the healing power of me knowing his story, we discussed him trying to know more about his father's story. But he was resistant, highly resistant, because he felt to do so would betray his mother and family somehow. But God kept leading him there, and so he faithfully followed. In time, he discovered that his father had volunteered to join the army when World War I broke out and was sent off to fight in the fields of France. In that terrible trench warfare, he was gassed with mustard gas. He had a metal plate in his skull from a severe head injury, and he had shell shock, known today as post-traumatic stress disorder. My grandfather struggled greatly with his physical and mental health the remainder of his life until he died alone in a VA hospital out in Prescott, Arizona. It was so powerful to watch my dad begin to forgive his dad simply by getting to know his story. He never, for even an instant, minimized the damage his dad had done by leaving the family. Those heartbreaks and hardships were real, and they were devastating. But now, with his dad's story, he began to forgive and slowly found freedom from the guilt and shame he personally felt. The final straw for my dad was when he learned that when World War II broke out, his dad had tried to re-enlist. He couldn't even take care of himself, his lungs ravaged from the mustard gas, but he wanted to go once again and fight for his country. That knowledge set my dad on a journey to Prescott, Arizona, where he found his dad's grave. And on that piece of hallowed ground, he finally laid down his pain. My father had taken a courageous journey to know his father's story, and because of it, he became a free man. My dad made me promise to tell others like you this story. He knew that it would be hard for me to do so, but he made me promise because he wanted it to help free up the lives of other dads and sons just like it did his and mine. In fact, we spent the last 20 years of his life helping other sons know their father's story and watching in awe as it transformed relationship after relationship. This is the power of story. Don't miss it with your dad or with your son.